All right, everyone. So this is part 2 of our lecture on motivation. This is where we left off in our class on Tuesday. So let's continue with this. So when we talk about motivations for control, we talked about maybe implicit theories of the self, influencing theories for control, and then implicit theories of the world. So let's talk about these different implicit theories of the world, which are very similar to our implicit theories of the self. So for implicit theories of the world, we have the entity theory of the world, where the world around you is fixed and is beyond your ability to change it. So what people do in these instances is because the world around you is fixed, you change yourself in order to fit within your social world. So the example here would be the smooth wall, because people got these stones and shaped them in a way that would fit and make a cohesive wall. They couldn't really change the environment. Whereas people with an incremental theory of the world see the world as being flexible and responsive to our efforts to change it. So changing the social world may change to accommodate the actions and desires of its members. So you can use these stones and sort of change them and fit them in order to make this wall. There's also primary and secondary control. Primary control describes changing existing realities to fit your perceptions, goals, or desires. If you have this kind of control, this means that you have an internal locus of control. You yourself think that you have an influence on the environment. You have your own sense of agency. For example, you think that studying for a test will lead to better results. This is more common in Western contexts, where secondary control, you align yourself and you sort of fit yourself with the existing reality by controlling your psychological impact. You have a more external locus of control. This leads you to not want to change the environment. This leads you to adjust to your environment and accept the realities of your environment. So this is more common in non-Western contexts. So if you'll remember the article we read on moving chairs in Starbucks, for people in East Asian cultures, they tend to have secondary control. They accepted that the chairs were in their way and they moved themselves in order to adjust to the way that the world was. So just to give you an idea of how primary control and secondary control are sort of the overarching theories that capture the different types of motivations that we've discussed. Primary control has an incremental theory of the world, which means it's more growth mindset focused, more of, in terms of the world, you have more of an entity theory of the self. So you think that you can change the world, but you can't really change yourself. You have a fixed mindset here, and you have an independent view of yourself. So the self should not have to change. It's stable and it's a bound entity. And the world is responsive to our efforts to change the world. With secondary control, on the other hand, we have an entity theory of the world. The world itself is fixed, but we can change ourselves to fit the fixed world. And this occurs more in countries that have interdependent views of the self. So as you might expect, secondary control strategies are more common in non-Western contexts than in Western ones, while primary control strategies are more common in the West than elsewhere. So for an exam, I might ask questions about a more Western versus a more Eastern culture, what kind of control they engage in, and what kind of theories they have about themselves and the world. So for primary control, it's incremental theory of the world. For secondary control, it's incremental theory of the self. For primary control, it's entity theory of the self. And for secondary control, it's entity theory of the world. So another way that I would think about incremental versus entity is incremental is growth mindset sort of focused, whereas entity theory of the self is more fixed. All right, so there is one study that examined this kind of primary and secondary control, And they compared Japanese and American aerobics classes. So what motivated people to go to these different aerobics classes? So clearly everyone's motivated by fitness, but why did they choose these specific classes? So when asked why people chose the class and what they do when the instructor initiates a difficult move, first, what motivated them to choose the class? One, Americans chose classes at times more convenient for them. So they viewed the schedule as being more flexible. So they chose a schedule that fit them, whereas Japanese chose classes based on the class's level. So they were reflecting on the classes and their own abilities. Americans were more likely to do their own move if the instructor's move was difficult, whereas the Japanese participants tried hard to keep up with the instructor. All right, so this is how motives affect something as simple as going to an exercise class. There's also a sense of not just self or the world fixed or growth mindset, but there's also group agencies. So collectivistic societies focus more on groups than in individuals, and they perceive these groups as agents, so as a unit. So psychologists tend to equate agency with individuals rather than groups, which might reflect the field's development, which has been largely in Western or individual cultural contexts. And this might reflect in news outlets in different cultures and how they report on scandals involving, for instance, financial scandals or rogue stock traders. So in this study conducted by Menon and colleagues in 1999, they compared newspapers in different countries reporting on financial scandals, and they analyzed whether newspapers focused on the individual, so the person that was convicted, or the group, the management of the bank. So I have my little red pen here. So on the x-axis, we have the individual versus the organization. So what do they attribute or in the newspaper articles, do they talk more about the individual's role in the shady financial trading, or do they talk more about the organization's role in shady financial trading? On the y-axis represents the percentage of newspaper references, and the green bar represents Asian newspapers, whereas the New York Times represents more Western newspapers. So as you can see, people or newspapers were more likely to attribute the rogue financial decisions to the individual in Western countries than they did in Eastern countries, whereas the opposite is true when we're looking at attributing the scandal to the organization. Asian countries attributed or talked more about the organization's fault in leading to those rogue financial decisions relative to those in Western countries. So even the way that newspapers talk about things like scandals, financial scandals, can be shaped by perceptions of group agency. So the results suggest that Japanese may be more likely to hold groups responsible for outcomes, whereas Americans tend to think about events in terms of the individuals involved. So this is why if one member of your group behaves in a negative way, that could reflect negatively on the group, and the group could face punishments because of one group member's negative behaviors. They're going to say that the group allowed that to happen. What about when it comes to making choices? So North American contexts strongly emphasize choice relative to other cultures. I mean, if you go to Walmart and you look at the cookie aisle, like they have a whole aisle dedicated to cookies. You can go and see hundreds of choices of cookies, right? Sometimes those cookies will be dupes of other cookies. So you'll have like the brand name Oreos, and you'll have the Walmart brand Oreos, and you'll have some other bootleg brand Oreos. So there's a lot of choices to make. And this is one way that primary control is evident. So for instance, a number of studies have compared Indian and Americans' perceptions of choices. So what we find is that Indians take longer than Americans to make choices, suggesting that decision-making tends to be more difficult for Indians than Americans. And Indians don't respond as negatively as Americans when they don't get what they wanted, their choice. Indians consider fewer actions as a matter of choice. They might believe more in predestination. And Americans view more important actions as a matter of choice, like where you want to go to college. But also, some non-Western cultures leave important decisions to close others. So instead of making these big decisions about where to go to college, who to marry, where to buy a home themselves, they let these people that care about them and know their needs, have the group's best interests in mind, choose for them instead of them choosing themselves. So in one study, they examined culture and choice in fifth graders, and it was a computer game that was chosen either by the child, the out group, or the in group. So they were told, you're going to play a game, and either this game was chosen by you, or it was chosen by a third grade class, and these are fifth graders, so they're going to look negatively on the third grade class, or your in group, students in your class. The dependent variable was the number of games attempted. So let's look at what happened here. All right, so on the x-axis, we have the different groups when it was your personal choice, whether it was the out-group choice, so the third graders, or the in-group choice. What we find among European Americans, and the y-axis, sorry, the y-axis is the number of games attempted. The green bars represent European Americans. The yellow or orange bars represent Asian Americans. So what we find here is that among European Americans, the European American children tend to play more games when it was a personal choice relative to whether it was an out-group or an in-group choice. Now, what we find among Asian Americans is that Asian Americans persist or play more games when they're told that the game that they are playing is due to the choices of an in-group. Like I just said, Indians prefer, or a lot of non-Western countries prefer others to make a choice for them. So they played a lot more games when their in-group made the choice versus when the out-group or they themselves made a choice. So to review, European American children were most motivated to play the game if they chose it themselves, whereas Asian American children were most motivated if the game was chosen by their in-group. All right, I'm going to put this video up so you can take a look at it. It's about the paradox of choice and how in the US we want a lot of different options when it comes to food, when it comes to cars, when it comes to the kinds of clothes that we wear. But there is a negative consequences to having so many choices, is that it makes it difficult for us to actually make a decision. So Americans prefer having many choices. This is just what I said. However, making too many choices can be detrimental. So making a choice can deplete your mental resources. So, I mean, I'm sure you all encounter this when you're trying to decide where to go to eat with your friends or with a partner. You're like, where should we go to eat? And you're like, oh, I want to go to Popeyes. And like, well, we already had chicken. And you're like, but I like chicken. And you have to think of all the positive and the negative consequences of going to a restaurant. And by the end of the argument, you're like, you know what? I don't even want to eat anymore, right? Because it depletes your mental resources. After making many choices, Americans tend to persist less and make more mistakes on tasks in experimental settings. And making choices is especially difficult in cultures that place a high value on the outcome. So in other words, high stakes makes the choice more stressful. But there's also learned helplessness. So the absolute lack of choice is negative. So if you only have one thing, that's not great either. This leads to a decreased feeling of control, which is associated with psychological costs. And this leads to a state called learned helplessness, where you feel powerless and unable to control or avoid unpleasant events that leads to stress and depression. So for instance, in a comparison of people in West Berlin and East Berlin during the Cold War, East People who lived in East Berlin were more likely to exhibit signs of depression and learned helplessness due to having less control over their life outcomes than West Berliners. For instance, East Berliners were more likely to exhibit frowns, slumped body postures, and other similar characteristics. What about a person's socioeconomic background? That could also be related to perceptions of control and could affect their motivation. People working in working class contexts are more likely to face hardship and less likely to have control over their circumstances. I'm sure many of you are like, no duh. So in this study, they investigated choice and socioeconomic status. What they found, or what they manipulated, or what they were investigating, is whether working class and upper middle class Americans would choose a different kind of pen after completing a survey. So there were two different conditions. They were either provided with a choice of pen, so the free choice condition, or their choice was taken away. This is called the usurped choice condition. They were just forced to give a pen. So in the usurped choice, they chose a pen, but then the experiment said, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have that pen. It's the last of its kind I have. Here, take this one. And then they were given a different pen. The experimenter then measured how much participants liked the pen. What they found was that working class participants liked the pen as much, regardless of whether they chose or had the choice usurped, but upper middle class participants were more or less satisfied when the choice was usurped. So it seems like in order to deal with the lack of control in their lives, working class people adapt and are as satisfied with outcomes that they have no control over, whereas middle or high upper class people tend to prefer to have choice and they have a sense of control. All right, if we were in class, we would have this discussion. So is it best to go along with the group or do your own thing? Well, we all know about the study with conformity, Ash's conformity study, where it was an unambiguous line task. You were given a sample line and you're asked to choose the line on the right side that matches the length of the line here. Clearly, the right answer is B, but in Ash's line study, they had other people say A or other people say C. And then participants were asked which one was the same length as the target line. Even though the answer was obvious, the majority of American participants conformed on at least one of the 12 trials in the experiment, showing that conformity is common even in individualistic cultures like the United States. But why do people conform? They may have been afraid of how others would react if they went against the group. There are social costs to disagreeing with the group. But the social cost of dissenting or disagreeing with a group might be especially strong in collectivistic societies. Remember that a key goal in collectivistic cultural contexts is to be interdependent, or achieve belongingness with others. So they're just trying to fit in. So in individualistic cultures, people are motivated to be independent, to highlight their distinctiveness, which fosters a greater sense of independence from others. So the cost of dissenting might be less severe in independent cultures, but even though it's still less severe, it still has an impact. And that's why we can see so much conformity in Ash's line studies. All right. We just talked about a little bit about this. There are different motives that cultures might have. So cultures might be motivated to conform, or they might be motivated to be unique. And as you could probably guess, people are more motivated to conform in collectivistic societies, where motivation to be unique might be stronger in individualistic cultures. We have another pen study. This is a really cool design, probably really quick to run and very inexpensive to run. So in these studies, participants were shown a group of colored pens with some colors in the majority and other colors in the minority. And then they asked participants, which pen would you like? In line with East Asians' desire for conformity, they tended to choose the majority pens, whereas European Americans tended to choose the minority pens, which is consistent with wanting to be unique. And here's a graph showing those effects. So the minority colored pen versus the majority colored pen. Green bar are Americans, orange bar are East Asians, and the y-axis represents the percentage of people that are making that choice. So as you can see, Americans largely preferred the minority colored pen rather than the majority colored pen, in line with the desire for uniqueness, whereas East Asians preferred the majority colored pen relative to the minority colored pen, which is in line for their desire for conformity. Another way that we can see motivations for conformity or uniqueness in these different countries are the cultural messages that are expressed in advertisements. In this study, again, conducted by Kim and Marcus. So Kim, I think her name is Hee-Jung Kim. She was actually one of my professors at UCSB. So in this study, they compared ads in the US and South Korea on the use of uniqueness and conformity themes in order to sell things. So think about advertisements that you see in the US with your cell phone or computer or the kind of snacks that you eat. What you can guess, and what was the result of the study, are that American ads contained more themes of uniqueness. So be unique, be you, and if you buy this computer, if you buy this phone, you'll be more unique. While South Korean ads contained more themes of fitting in. All right, so what is the summary of this lecture? So we talked about self-enhancement and self-improvement. So self-enhancement is not a universal phenomenon and is contrasted with self-improvement. We talked about self-enhancement being a motive in US or Western cultures, whereas in more East Asian cultures or collectivistic cultures, people are motivated to self-improve so that they can maintain their group standing. There are concerns about face in some cultures that lead them to have a prevention orientation. So they want to prevent being lost, losing their status in the group, which is contrasted with having a promotion orientation that more Westerners engage in. And what choice means and the importance of choice differs across cultures, even in terms of who makes the decisions and who you trust would prefer to make the decisions. And these cultural differences are often seen in various types of media outlets. Right, great. So we finished the second part of the lecture in 20 minutes. It's interesting. I think I went through almost as many slides in class and it took me about an hour and 30 minutes, but I love having those conversations with y'all. So that's the end of today's lecture. I will see you all on Tuesday. I'll post up the journal as well in a few minutes. So let me just stop the share, or can I do this? Okay, yes, I can do it. Stop share. All right, see you later. Bye.